Good evening again. Good evening. So if I may, I'd like to offer a few thoughts on what I saw this evening at your club here in Harrow. Yes, Harrow. Yes, first of all, sort of general comments of the club in general. This is, for any of you who've been there, this is very different from Athenians in many ways. It's a very different venue. It's a fairly different crowd, and it's run in a different way. There were a few things I noticed. I arrived extremely early, mistakenly believing that this would start about the same time as our club, and also thinking the bridge was a pub. So finally I managed to find it, and I was welcomed very warmly. I was also given a guest handout. These little details do matter. They're things that will stick with you after you've gone. Recommendations, there are a couple of things that aren't here, which is certainly not to say that everything we do is better, but there are a couple of things that we do use. One is a bell with a timekeeper. Now, you may object to that. You may think it's a bit abrupt or rude, but I think it does offer some kind of sense of ritual on occasion. Just a little tinkle of the bell at the end of the speeches to give people a prompt. However, you did offer tea and coffee and drinks, and we don't offer any of those things at Athenian, so that was fantastic. Your president, Tony Wynyard, I imagine he gets this comment quite a lot, because I've heard it several times at Athenians, but big smile, a very welcoming person, someone you do want to see leading the evening. Everyone feels at ease, I think it's safe to say. If I was to suggest anything to Tony here, perhaps a little more energy right at the beginning of his opening. So, good evening, or something like that. Now this, again, it's not to everybody's taste, it's not everybody's style, but the tone of the evening rests to a large degree on how it's set right at the beginning. And to give it that energy right, particularly when people have been at work, they're rubbing their eyes, a bit tired, just to give it a bit of a boost early on can be a great thing. But Tony, as I'm sure you may have noticed, is a master of the stance. You may think, what is a master of the stance? Because all of us can stand up. However, it's deceptively tricky, and you notice that if you ever see yourself speaking on a video, you start doing this, or you wander off to the side, and you've got these strange little tics. Tony doesn't. Tony stands in a relaxed manner, not uptight, not too in your face, just very well composed, and a very good stance for holding the meeting. Your Toastmaster, David Phillips, another very reassuring presence. Might I say an avuncular tone. We understand. You're among friends. You can't really overestimate how important words like that are for people who've never been here, and to whom the thought of going up and speaking in front of people spontaneously is akin to social death. So this is always great to hear. If I was to suggest anything, a couple of minor things. One is, I think it's always a good idea to tell people to switch off their phones. I think a phone did go off, and it can be enormously awkward when people are speaking. And one other thing, for an MC, it's always a good idea, I think, to end the introduction with the person's name. So, giving his number 3 speech, it's Tony Wynyard! Yay! Rather than saying it's Tony Wynyard with his number 3 speech, and it fizzles out a bit thereafter. However, itinerary, roles, and educational program could not have been any more thoroughly explained. Any of you who are new tonight, I am sure, will know very clearly about what was on here now. Our timekeeper, Jay Shree, despite proclaimed nerves, she came up here with a winning smile and a voice that was very audible, very confident way to speak. Was to recommend something, perhaps a little stiff in the stance. It's not necessarily something that you can just relax when doing, and I think it would have benefited the other people here if the role had been explained a bit more clearly. Timekeeping is important in general, yes, but it's also specifically important for this, because messages can be much better honed if you keep them short and to the point. And I think it's worth explaining this. But overall, a competent and good, was it first effort? Second effort as timekeeper, so well done. Table Topics Master, Robert Baker. What I really liked about Robert's Table Topics was he kept the explanation and the questions brief. There's a massive temptation when you try to think of something new and novel to do for Table Topics to come up with these really elaborate ideas and questions that will twist and turn all over the place. But this should really be about the speakers. You should maximize the time for the speakers, because they are who it's all about ultimately. Recommendation. Robert had a tendency to stand over here. And I was sat right there, so I could really only see him in profile. So fine over here, a bit off-putting for people sat over there. And there was no wrap-up to his section that I heard. So something like, it's been a pleasure being a Table Topics Master, and I'll hand you back to your Toastmaster. What I like though, also, that I think Robert was a little tricky with his topics by saying, oh, this is actually very simple. I don't think so. Those are not topics I would have found very easy to answer. They were quite broad and conceptual. That said, if anyone's been to a contest, some of the questions there are completely off the wall. So it does pay to have these sort of rather more abstract concepts tackled from time to time. Evaluator 1, Mike. I have to say, all of the evaluations were exceptional. There was a real, for those of you who are new, it's a real lesson in how it's done. Mike's was exemplary, animated, specific. He complimented the computer crash syndrome. He noted that he paused before moving on to fellow Toastmasters, so he was paying attention. I would say, though, the lectern was a bit of a barrier. There was a tendency to stand behind it and occasionally step to the side. I would say it just provides, it creates a barrier between the speaker and the audience, so better to avoid if possible. But also Mike mentioned a specific point about eye contact and said that this is something that's improved over time, and that is something people love to hear. You're paying attention, you've seen noticeable improvements through coming here, it really makes you feel good to hear. Evaluator 2, Coral. I was mentioning the lecture, and Coral swept to the side of the lecture and spoke out to the audience, and it really connected, and I think you could feel the difference. That's how to use notes. I would say, and this is something that's noticed in contest conditions, I believe, that generally speaking, recommendations should be delivered in the third person, not the first person. It may be a bit different in a smaller club, but if you deliver it in the first person, it feels as if it's directed only to that person, whereas we should all be drawing lessons, hopefully, from what's being said. But what a fabulous way to give recommendations overall. You could hear that Carl did actually enjoy the speech. What I would have loved for Tony to do is, now that I thought was fantastic. And there was genuine affection for what she heard. Evaluator 3, Alan Gilman. Another thing I noticed, when you stand up to give the objectives, at our club all we do is stand up and give the objectives. It's a very dry exercise. Here, and Alan was perhaps the best exponent of this, he said, when we're children we take info in so many ways, and it became almost like a mini speech in itself, so I'll be as quick as I can. Someone pointed out, a heckler pointed out that in his actual intro for his evaluation, it went on a bit long. I do like these little inventive ways to start an evaluation. I think it's good. It provides variety. But this one I know has gone a little bit too long. I would say that what Alan did really exceptionally well, it can be very, very difficult to evaluate experienced speakers, of which Jill is obviously one. However, Alan offered great advice on how to do dialogue better. This was very specific, and he also wasn't afraid to say, I don't think you addressed your objectives on this occasion, which is something you hear surprisingly rarely, but which probably happens quite frequently. People will always say, did they pass objectives? Of course they did, as a kind of formality. So, well done for that. Finally, table topics earlier, Jill. No lectern. There was no lectern. The lectern was off the side. It was notes, just glanced at occasionally, but she was engaging with the audience, which was great. And she engaged the audience more than that. She actually spoke to us. She said, didn't you think he was easy to listen to? Yes, we did. I would also recommend to Jill that perhaps more recommendations should be done in the third person. I felt perhaps with people standing up and her talking to them, it was a touch matronly, but so perhaps you let them sit down and then speak in the third person, they might feel more comfortable. But the valuations were very, for table topics, it's so easy to say, oh yes, great body language, and good eye contact, again and again and again. But this was very specific and different for each person. and ended so encouragingly. You're wonderful, she said. And who could argue that?